Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and hopefully you're enjoying your weekend. Obviously it's Saturday evening and I'm sure most of you are watching things like Strictly Come Dancing and so on. However, we have, as always, been working, and we've also been doing videos like the one we're doing at the moment. And tonight's video, I thought I would give the theme of rich people dining in the Middle Ages. In other words, if you were a lord of the manor, maybe you were even a king, for example, or anyone of the upper echelons of society, how would you dine? Is it just a case of sitting at a table and eating? Well, actually, it's not. There is a whole host of rules that a person has to abide by. And one of the best sources of information we've got for this is books such as the Book of Courtesy, for example, and it tells you the correct manner of eating and the correct way that you should be addressing guests, for example. In a way, it's very much like the books that you get in the Victorian era, which tells you how to host a dinner party, for example. If you look at Mrs. Beeton, for example, you get advice in there. So in the Middle Ages, if you were rich enough, you would invite people to dine with you. And if you're someone like the royal family, like the king, for example, people would actually pay, or in some cases get invited to watch the monarch dine. And that sounds very, very odd, but that was the norm right up to pretty much the 19th and early 20th century, believe it or not. You'd have courtiers who would sit in the presence of a king or queen whilst they eat, for example. It was seen as an honour to be able to do that. So if you were rich enough, what would it be like? Well, to start with, you would definitely not have a bare table. Bare tables were typical of the lower classes. That's if you could afford a table, that is. So your table would literally be wood, and it may even have, for example, a rushlight holder on it, or in some cases they were actually hammered into the wood of the table. If you were of this greatness, if you were of the upper classes, if you were rich enough, even if you were the monarch, for example, then you would definitely have tablecloths, and these would have to be ironed. And there was a very particular way they were ironed in the Middle Ages. Usually you use what was called a smoothing a globe or a smoothing stone, and these were nothing more than heated up stone in some cases, but for the very, very rich, it was usually a piece of glass, and it would be heated up in the fire and then rubbed across the table linen. Now, in some cases, the upper classes would use more than one tablecloth, and in some cases, they actually use two or three. They often say the first tablecloth is to cover the table, and obviously it's very important to also cover the legs of the table. Later on in the Victorian age, people were said to faint if they saw a chair or table leg, for example. So the first one is literally a covering for the table, and this would often be of an unbleached linen, for example, but obviously ironed. Then they would often put a top layer, a second linen or second tablecloth on. Now, some people do actually say this is so when you're placing things on the table, you're not literally plonking it down, so it deadens the noise. So you're placing it gently on the table. And then the third, the uppermost table linen, was usually bleached white, often highly decorated as well, often embroidered, and this would usually be placed in a way where you can see the other two layers below it. In other words, it's saying, look at me, I have more than one piece of table linen, basically. When you look at what goes on the table, for the upper classes, obviously they're not going to use anything like wood, really. It's usually the best, and the best in the Middle Ages was either silver, sometimes gold if you're rich enough, if you're royalty, for example, but most of the time it was actually pewter. Even for monarchs, they often use pewter for everyday use, really. And the best thing about pewter is it is slightly cheaper than silver, and it's a mixture of tin and lead, and if you polish it, it will actually come up to look like silver, like this one here. This has been highly polished, and personally, if you feel the weight of it, you would think this is actually silver, but I can tell you now, this is obviously pewter. So you would have pewter plates on the table, pewter bowls on the table. And another peculiarity is something called a saucer. Now today we associate a saucer with something that goes under a cup, whereas if you listen to a talk by Helen all about tea, it's usually called a dish that goes underneath the cup. So what is a saucer? Well, the saucer, as the name suggests, was usually for medieval sauces that would accompany a meal. It's a bit like having a saucer today, or a small plate, and then squirting ketchup, Worcestershire sauce, brown sauce, and whatever else you want with your meal, basically. So it's surprising how many things that are actually on the table. Sometimes you would actually have a trencher. These were often made of silver or pewter, in other words, a square plate. And in the poorer homes, these were usually made out of a slice of bread or a very simple square of wood. Some people used to say years ago, that's where the saying comes from. If you think of soldiers long ago, join the army, get 3 meals a day, it usually comes from the fact that you have a square trencher, for example. But the plates would go on the table along with like the bowls and the saucers, as I said. And then you would also have, accompanying all that, your cutlery. Now, for medieval people, they had the best set of forks invented, really. And that is, you have 2 of them. You have a right and you also have a left. So these are your forks, basically. So these were usually used for picking the food up. And it sounds odd, but really until the 17th century, we don't really use forks in this country. It's something in a way that we have in the Restoration when we get Charles II, for example. So generally, you have 2 items. You have the spoon, either silver or pewter or even gold, and this was used for picking up the sloppier mixtures, the sloppier foods that you have on your plate. And then you would also have the knife, and the knife is actually the most important bit, really. This was used for cutting up meat, for example. And what they used to say years ago is you should never, and this is in the Book of Courtesy, you should never ever carve meat with your own knife. In other words, you would have the meat, for example, brought to your table, and you would have a knife attached or resting against the meat on the platter, and you have to cut it. And then once you've cut it and you've placed it on your plate, to put it into your mouth, you would either use your hand or your own knife. It was seen bad form, very bad form, if you actually cut the meat and then stab it and bring it to your mouth. Absolutely fantastic name as well. Small squares of meat to put in your mouth was actually known as gobbets, usually, because they fit in your gob, obviously. So this was your main fork if you're not using your hands, but obviously for cutting as well. This one is actually made of iron, and it's got a highly polished horn handle with small bronze rivets and also bits of other bronze work on there like that one. It's interesting, we only get rounded knives really when you get to the 17th century, and that's down to the fact that we've now got a fork, so you don't need a pointed knife anymore. When you look at spoons again, spoons are usually highly decorated as well. This one's got an acorn on the top. You often get ones with saints on, all types really. Anyway, you're probably thinking, it's not all food, surely. They must be drinking as well. And we know they did. They drank vast amounts. Now, when you look at the lower classes, their diet is predominantly vegetables. There's also fruit in there as well. And very much like our prehistoric ancestors. So they're making use of nuts and that sort of thing. The only meat they get is generally when you have a feast day. For example, Christmas. That's not that long away really. That would be a meat day. Generally it's a vegetable and fruit rich diet, so when you look at the lower classes, they're usually much more healthy. But the rich, however, they often turn their noses up at vegetables. We know they ate them, we know they ate fruit, but it was usually meat is what declared them really as the top end of society, and we know they had a vast amount of it. But when it came to drinking, we know that the lower classes had ale. Remember, beer only comes along really late medieval into the Tudor. And for the upper classes, it was generally wine. And some of the best quality wines actually came from places like France, for example. The only problem is when we were fighting the French, which was quite a common feature in the Middle Ages, it actually hampered our wine. So we ended up having to get cheaper alternatives. And you have to remember, wine was actually being produced in Britain as well, not on a big scale, not very good quality, but it was being made. This is the type of goblet that they were using a lot of, so a typical wine goblet. And obviously all this is highly polished, very, very shiny, and laid out on the table. So it makes the rich person look very, very special. It's a high status thing. Now, I do have another object that you will definitely find on a rich man's table, and that would be this item here. Now, I was going to use this for a Monday mystery, for example. However, I decided to bring this out now and show you. To be fair, I might use it for a Monday mystery at a later date. This is actually a salt cellar. Now, some of these, especially in royal households, are very, very ornate. In other words, you could have a large ship, for example, made out of gold, silver or pewter. This is a small pewter one, and you open it up, it sits perfectly flat on the table, and you take a pinch of salt and sprinkle it on your food. For the lower classes, they didn't really have that, purely because salt was quite an expensive thing. And in a way, that is always reserved for the top table, which is why there is a famous saying, when people sit below the salt, it basically means you're a lower class citizen, really. Now, when it came to eating, in the Book of Courtesy, it does actually state in there that you should have a napkin. There's actually rules saying that you shouldn't spit at the table. You definitely shouldn't use the tablecloth as a form of wiping your mouth. And another interesting thing, you are not to feed animals like dogs from the table. Now, when we go, and many people have in the past, to a medieval banquet, for example, people often throw food around. There's talk of large greyhounds walking around, you're feeding them meat. That did not happen. People ate with a lot of respect, and it's surprising how much respect people had. They even washed their hands. Even if they're not washing their bodies regularly, they washed their hands to show that they were important, and they followed the rules of society. Now, a napkin, very, very important. Napkins were quite large, and most people today would probably think the best option for a napkin is to push it down the front like so. Don't do that in the Middle Ages, because you were looked upon as slightly strange. Now, if I was an executioner and I was about to execute someone, one of the main ways that I would make money as an executioner would be to sell the person's property. For example, I would sell his clothes. If I chop his head off and there's now blood on his clothes, I won't get that much money. So if I was going to execute someone, I would tuck, for example, a napkin down his front like that. So when I cut his head off, it will hopefully protect his clothes underneath. So if you are a person that eats a meal by tucking the napkin down the front, in the Middle Ages, do not do it. A big no-no. Some people often think, well, I always place a napkin on my lap. That's another no-no, really. Why is it down there so far away from your face? Well, in the Middle Ages, as it was throughout history, really, even into the Tudor period beyond, napkins were often folded very, very narrow and thrown over the left shoulder. Several reasons behind this. Years ago, if you think of the old cartoons, you would have a little angel on your one shoulder whispering all the good in your ear. The devil generally sits on the left shoulder. It's the devil that whispers bad things into your head. It's also the reason why when we spill salt, famously, you throw it over your shoulder. It's the shoulder that the devil sits on, the left shoulder. The other reason for having it here is you can wipe your hands on it when you've been using your hands to pick up food, and obviously it's close enough for your mouth. So what you should be doing when you go into a restaurant, don't push it down the front, do not lie it on your lap, always throw it over your shoulder. I'll be quite interested if I go into a restaurant when COVID's away to see how many people's watch this video, and I'm sure I'll be able to tell, because if I look around the room I may see some people who have the napkin over the shoulder. So on that note, hopefully you've enjoyed our little introduction to etiquette, or in particular what dining was like for a medieval rich person. Let us know what other videos you would like to see. Do you want to see what the poor person did? Would you like to see Helen do some cooking, or do you want to see Ian talking about another D-Day themed project, or would you like to see me bring in a selection of swords, for example, to show you what was used in the past? Remember, this is as much your channel as it is ours. On that note, stay safe, have a good weekend, and we'll see you tomorrow on Sunday. See you soon. Bye.